I sighed heavily as Ryan pulled me aside, his face etched with concern. "Jillian, we need to talk," he said in a hushed tone. "What's wrong?" I asked, already dreading the answer. He glanced toward the kitchen where his mother, Helen, was bustling around. "Look at those tea bags on the rack. She reuses them." I followed his gaze and felt a wave of disgust wash over me. The tea bags were indeed withered and discolored, a testament to Helen's extreme frugality. "That's disgusting! This is how your mom welcomes us?" Ryan shook his head solemnly. "I'm sorry, but you know how she is. I just wanted to warn you before you made the mistake of drinking that tea." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. We had just arrived for our first visit to Ryan's childhood home, and already I was regretting it. Helen's reputation for being overly thrifty, some might say downright cheap, had preceded her, but this was a new level of absurdity. As if on cue, Helen emerged from the kitchen, a wide smile plastered on her face. "Jillian, dear, I've made us some lovely tea. Come, sit down and make yourself comfortable." I exchanged a worried glance with Ryan, but he gave me a subtle nod, silently urging me to keep the peace. Swallowing my disgust, I followed Helen into the living room and took a seat on the well-worn couch. Helen bustled about, pouring the tea into chipped mugs. "I hope you like it," she said, handing me a cup. "I always make sure to get my money's worth out of those tea bags." I forced a smile, gripping the mug tightly. "Thank you, Helen. It smells interesting." Ryan cleared his throat, attempting to steer the conversation in a different direction. "So, Mom, how have you been? It's been a while since we last visited." Helen waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, you know me, just pinching pennies wherever I can. Speaking of which, Jillian, I hope you don't mind if I ask you to take your shoes off before walking on the carpet. I like to keep things tidy without spending money on expensive cleaners." I fought the urge to roll my eyes, silently wondering what other indignities awaited me during this visit. As I slipped off my shoes, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping in. If this was just the beginning, how much worse could things get? A few weeks after the tea incident, Ryan and I started planning our wedding. I was excited to finally tie the knot, but Helen's presence loomed like a dark cloud over the joyous occasion. "Mom, we're thinking of having the ceremony at the church downtown," Ryan said during one of our planning sessions at Helen's place. Helen pursed her lips disapprovingly. "That sounds like an unnecessary expense. Why don't you have it here in the backyard? I can make all the decorations myself from recycled materials." I cringed at the thought of a backyard wedding adorned with repurposed junk. "Thank you for the offer, Helen, but we'd prefer something a bit more traditional." "Suit yourself," Helen said with a shrug. "But don't expect me to contribute financially. I'm on a fixed income, and every penny counts." Ryan shot me an apologetic look, but I was already seething inside. It was one thing for Helen to be frugal with her own money, but to refuse to contribute anything towards her only son's wedding felt like a slap in the face. "That's fine, Helen," I said through gritted teeth. "We'll figure it out ourselves." Later that evening, as Ryan and I discussed potential venues, I couldn't help but vent my frustrations. "Can you believe your mother?" I said, my voice rising with each word. "Not only does she expect us to have a tacky homemade wedding, but she won't even chip in a dime towards it." Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know. She's always been like this. I'm sorry, Jillian. I wish there was something I could do." "Well, there is something you can do," I said, an idea forming in my mind. "You can stand up to her for once. This is our wedding, and we should have it the way we want, without her constant criticism and penny pinching." Ryan looked torn, his loyalty to his mother clashing with his desire to please me. "I'll try talking to her again," he said finally. "But you know how stubborn she can be." I nodded, already feeling the seeds of resentment taking root. If Helen wasn't going to cooperate, then I would have to find a way to make her see reason, even if it meant playing hardball. As the weeks went by, the wedding planning only grew more stressful. Helen consistently shot down our ideas, insisting on cheaper alternatives that lacked any semblance of elegance or class. I found myself constantly at odds with her, and Ryan was caught in the middle, desperately trying to keep the peace. One particularly heated argument erupted when Helen suggested I wear an old wedding dress that she would remodel for me. "Absolutely not," I shouted, my patience finally snapping. This is supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and I refuse to look like a ragamuffin because you're too cheap to let me buy a proper dress." Helen's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Watch your tone, young lady. I'm only trying to save you money." "Well, we don't need your kind of saving," I spat back. "If you're not going to support us, then maybe you shouldn't be involved at all." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of hurt in Helen's eyes. But just as quickly her expression hardened, and she turned her back on me without another word. As the tension in the room threatened to suffocate us, I couldn't help but wonder if I had gone too far. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning of a long, bitter battle, and I was determined to come out on top, no matter the cost. Tensions reached a boiling point during a pre-wedding family dinner. My parents, Louise and Robert, had come over to Helen's place to discuss the final arrangements. As we gathered around the table, Helen wasted no time in making her opinions known. "I still think a backyard wedding would be the most economical choice," she said, her tone smug. I felt my jaw clench, but before I could respond, my mother spoke up. Jillian deserves to have the wedding of her dreams," she said, her speech slightly slurred due to her impairment. Helen's eyes narrowed as she regarded my mother. "Well, I'm sure she would if she had the money for it," she said pointedly. My father bristled at the implied insult. "What's that supposed to mean?" he demanded, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. Helen shrugged unapologetically. "I'm just saying, not everyone can afford to splurge on extravagant affairs." I could feel the tension in the room escalating rapidly. Ryan shot me a pleading look, silently begging me to defuse the situation. "Mom, that's enough," he said, turning to Helen. "We've already discussed our plans, and we're sticking to them." But Helen was relentless, her eyes glinting with a malicious gleam. "Well, if you ask me, it's a waste of money. But I suppose that's easy for you to say when you're not the one footing the bill." My father slammed his fist on the table, causing the silverware to rattle. "Listen here, you old bat," he snarled, his face flushed with anger. "We've worked hard our entire lives to provide for our daughter, and we'll be damned if we let you disrespect us like this." The room fell deathly silent, everyone holding their breath in anticipation of Helen's response. For a moment, I thought she might back down, but then her lips curved into a smug smile. "Well, it's no wonder Jillian turned out the way she did, with a foul-mouthed brute like you as her father," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. That was the final straw. My mother burst into tears, and my father leapt to his feet, his face contorted with rage. Ryan quickly stepped between them, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Enough," he shouted, his voice trembling with emotion. "Mom, you've gone too far this time. I won't have you insulting Jillian's family like that." Helen scoffed, seemingly unfazed by the chaos she had caused. "I'm only speaking the truth," she said dismissively. I watched in stunned silence as my father struggled to regain his composure, his body shaking with barely contained fury. In that moment, I knew that no matter what happened, things would never be the same between our families. As the evening drew to a close, Ryan and I walked my parents to their car in tense silence. Once they had driven away, he turned to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and frustration. "I'm so sorry, Jillian," he said, his voice heavy with remorse. "I never thought she would stoop so low." I shook my head, fighting back tears of my own. "Don't apologize for her," I said, my voice trembling. "This is who she is, a bitter, miserable woman who takes pleasure in tearing others down." Ryan pulled me into a tight embrace, and for a moment I allowed myself to find solace in his warmth. But deep down, I knew that this was only the beginning of a long, bitter battle, one that would test the very limits of our love and resolve. As we stood there, locked in each other's arms, I couldn't help but wonder if there would ever be a way to heal the wounds that Helen had inflicted. But one thing was certain. I would stop at nothing to protect my family, even if it meant going to war with the woman who had given birth to my husband. After the disastrous family dinner, Ryan and I decided to put some distance between us and his mother for a while. We focused on our upcoming wedding, determined not to let Helen's bitterness ruin our special day. A few months later, I gave birth to our beautiful daughter, Lily. Holding her in my arms for the first time, I felt an overwhelming sense of joy and peace wash over me. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the drama with Helen, not the stress of wedding planning, nothing. For a brief period, there was a fragile truce between us and Helen. She seemed genuinely happy to have a granddaughter, and even made an effort to be on her best behavior around us. I dared to hope that perhaps this new addition to our family would be the catalyst for change, bringing us all closer together. But as Lily grew older, Helen's true colors began to show once again. "Jillian, you really should let me babysit Lily more often," she said during one of our visits. "You know how expensive daycare can be." I bristled at her suggestion, already sensing an ulterior motive. "Thank you, Helen, but we've got it covered." She clucked her tongue disapprovingly. "Suit yourself, but don't come crying to me when you can't afford it anymore." As if on cue, my mother entered the room, and Lily's face lit up with delight. "Gamma Lou," she exclaimed, using the special name she had given my mother. Helen's expression soured as Lily rushed into my mother's arms, chattering excitedly in the sign language my mother had taught her. "Really, Jillian, do you think it's wise to encourage that nonsense?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. I felt my blood boil at her insensitive remark. "It's not nonsense, Helen," I snapped. "It's a way for Lily to communicate with her grandmother." Helen scoffed dismissively. "Well, I think it's a waste of time. She'll never get anywhere in life relying on those silly hand gestures." Before I could respond, Lily turned to Helen, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Why are you being mean to Gamalou?" she asked, her voice trembling with hurt. Helen's eyes widened in surprise, clearly not expecting Lily to understand her biting words. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of remorse in her expression, but it was quickly replaced by her usual haughty demeanor. "Don't be ridiculous, child," she said dismissively. "I was merely stating a fact. Your grandmother would do well to focus on more practical skills." Lily's lip quivered, and she buried her face in my mother's shoulder, seeking comfort from Helen's cruelty. My heart broke for her, and in that moment I knew that I had to do something to protect her from the toxic influence of her own grandmother. As Helen left the room, I pulled Ryan aside, my hands shaking with barely contained rage. "This has gone on long enough," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Your mother is a poisonous influence, and I won't have her belittling my family anymore." Ryan sighed heavily, his expression weary. "I know, Jillian. Believe me, I know. But what can we do? She's my mother, and despite everything, I still love her." I shook my head adamantly. "Love or not, this behavior is unacceptable. Either she changes, or we cut her out of our lives for good." Ryan's eyes widened in surprise, but he didn't argue. Deep down, he knew I was right. For Lily's sake, we couldn't allow Helen's toxic presence to continue unchecked. As I held my daughter close, whispering soothing words in her ear, I made a silent vow. No matter what it took, I would protect her from the cruelty of her own grandmother, even if it meant severing ties with Helen forever. Despite the tension between us, Helen was still invited to Ryan and my wedding. A part of me had hoped that the joyous occasion would soften her heart and bring some semblance of peace to our fractured family. But as the day unfolded, it became clear that Helen had no intention of changing her ways. From the moment she arrived, Helen made it a point to critique every aspect of the ceremony and reception. "You spent how much on those centerpieces?" she whispered incredulously as we made our way to the head table. "You could have made those yourself with some wildflowers and mason jars." I gritted my teeth, determined not to let her ruin this special day. "Thank you for your input, Helen," I said through a forced smile. "But we wanted everything to be perfect." Her eyes narrowed, and I could see the disdain written all over her face. "Well, if you ask me, it's all a waste of money. But I suppose that's easy for you to say when you're not the one footing the bill." Ryan shot me a pleading look, silently begging me to let it go. But before I could respond, Helen had already moved on to her next target, the elaborate 5-tier wedding cake. "You know, back in my day, we made our own cakes," she said loudly, drawing the attention of nearby guests. "None of this fancy, overpriced nonsense." I felt my cheeks burning with embarrassment as several heads turned in our direction. Ryan quickly stepped in, trying to defuse the situation. "Mom, please," he hissed, his voice strained. "Not here. Not today." But Helen was undeterred, her eyes gleaming with a perverse delight at the discomfort she was causing. As the reception wore on, her antics only grew more outrageous. When the servers began passing around hors d'oeuvres, she whipped out a small Tupperware container from her purse and started scooping them up like a squirrel hoarding nuts for winter. "What?" she said defensively when she noticed my stunned expression. "These things cost a fortune. I'm just trying to get my money's worth." I wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. Around us, guests were starting to whisper and point, their faces a mixture of amusement and second-hand embarrassment. Ryan's father, Harold, was mortified. "Helen, please," he begged, his face flushed with shame. "You're making a scene." But Helen was beyond reason, consumed by her own twisted sense of frugality. She continued to stuff her Tupperware container, oblivious to the stares and murmurs surrounding her. As the evening drew to a close, Ryan and I said our goodbyes to our guests, thanking them for sharing in our special day. But as we turned to leave, we were met with a sight that made our hearts sink. Helen standing by the exit, a smug grin on her face and a bulging Tupperware container tucked under her arm. "What?" she said innocently, catching our horrified stares. "I'm just trying to save a few bucks for the happy couple." In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to wrap my hands around her scrawny neck and throttle her. But instead, I took a deep breath and turned to Ryan, my eyes pleading with him to do something, anything, to rein in his mother's outrageous behavior. But Ryan could only shake his head, his expression one of utter defeat. It was clear that on this day, the day that was supposed to be the happiest of our lives, Helen had won. As we walked out into the night, leaving a trail of whispers and judgmental stares in our wake, I felt a cold, hard knot of resentment take root in my heart. This was supposed to be our moment, our chance to celebrate the love and commitment we shared. But once again, Helen had found a way to make it all about her and her twisted obsession with frugality. In that moment, I made a silent vow to myself. One day, somehow, I would make Helen pay for all the pain and humiliation she had caused. It might take years, even decades, but karma has a way of catching up to those who deserve it most. And when it did, I would be there to savor every delicious moment of her downfall. The air was thick with tension as we gathered at the funeral home to say goodbye to Ryan's father, Harold. What should have been a solemn occasion was quickly overshadowed by Helen's usual antics. "I can't believe the prices they charge for these things," she muttered under her breath as we filed into the viewing room. "It's highway robbery, if you ask me." I shot her a warning look, but she seemed utterly oblivious to the inappropriateness of her comments. As we took our seats, I noticed her eyes darting around the room, scanning every surface with a critical gaze. It wasn't until the service began that I realized what she was up to. As the minister spoke, delivering a heartfelt eulogy, Helen reached into her purse and pulled out a small roll of toilet paper. With a furtive glance around, she quickly stuffed it into her pocket. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Even in the face of death, Helen's obsession with frugality knew no bounds. I nudged Ryan, gesturing discreetly towards his mother, but he simply shook his head, too consumed by grief to deal with her nonsense. After the service, as we gathered in the lobby to greet mourners, Helen's behavior took an even more disturbing turn. "Did you see the spread they had set up?" she whispered to me, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "All those fancy little sandwiches and pastries? You know how much they must have spent on that." Before I could respond, she had already made a beeline for the refreshment table, her purse clutched tightly in her hands. I watched in horror as she began scooping up handfuls of food, stuffing them into her purse with reckless abandon. "Helen, what are you doing?" I hissed, trying to keep my voice low. "This is a funeral, for God's sake." But Helen was too far gone, consumed by her own twisted sense of greed. She continued to plunder the table, oblivious to the shocked stares of the other mourners. It wasn't until Lily, my sweet, innocent daughter, caught sight of her grandmother's actions that the true extent of Helen's depravity was laid bare. "Grandma, why are you taking all that food?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion. Helen froze, her face flushing with embarrassment as she realized she had been caught red-handed. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of remorse in her eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by her usual defiance. "Mind your own business, child," she snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "I'm just trying to save a few bucks, that's all." Lily's eyes widened, and she took a step back, her small body trembling with fear and hurt. In that moment, something inside me snapped. "That's enough, Helen," I snarled, my voice resonating with a fury I had never known before. "You've gone too far this time." Helen opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off with a wave of my hand. "No, don't even try to justify this," I said, my words slicing through the tense silence like a knife. "You've humiliated us for the last time." Ryan, his face etched with a mix of relief and shame, stepped forward to stand by my side. For once, he didn't try to play the peacemaker. He knew that his mother had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. As the whispers and stares of the other mourners washed over us, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction settle in my chest. Finally, after years of enduring Helen's cruelty and humiliation, the tables had turned. And as she stood there, her face flushed with embarrassment and her purse stuffed with stolen goods, I knew that this was only the beginning of her downfall. The community that had once turned a blind eye to her eccentricities was now watching, their judgmental eyes scrutinizing her every move. And as word of her actions at the funeral spread, I knew that the same people who had once tolerated her would now turn against her, casting her out like the pariah she truly was. As we left the funeral home, Helen trailing behind us with her head hung in shame, I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of vindication. The karma that had been building for years had finally been unleashed, and I knew that there would be no escaping its wrath. The aftermath of Helen's shameful behavior at the funeral was swift and merciless. Word of her actions spread like wildfire through our small community, and suddenly she found herself the target of scorn and ridicule from all corners. It started with the whispers and pointed stares whenever she ventured out in public. The neighbors who had once tolerated her eccentricities now regarded her with thinly veiled contempt, their eyes following her every move as if she were a common criminal. Then came the more overt acts of harassment. One morning, Helen awoke to find her front yard littered with toilet paper rolls, a cruel mockery of her theft from the funeral home. Another day, she returned from running errands to find a bag of stale bread left on her doorstep, a twisted reminder of her obsession with never letting anything go to waste. At first, Helen tried to brush off these incidents, her pride too strong to admit that she had brought this upon herself. But as the days turned into weeks, and the harassment showed no signs of letting up, her defiant facade began to crack. "They're treating me like a pariah," she lamented to Ryan during one of our rare visits, "all because I was trying to save a few bucks." I couldn't help but scoff at her self-pity. "You brought this on yourself, Helen," I said, my voice devoid of sympathy. "Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences for your actions?" Helen's eyes narrowed, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of the bitter, spiteful woman she had become. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" she spat. "You've always hated me, and now you're reveling in my humiliation." I met her gaze unflinchingly, refusing to back down. "I don't hate you, Helen," I said, my voice calm and measured. "But I won't stand by and let you continue to humiliate and belittle my family." Ryan, caught in the middle as always, tried to play peacemaker. "Mom, Jillian's right," he said gently. "What you did at Dad's funeral was inexcusable. You need to take responsibility for your actions." But Helen was beyond reason, her mind twisted by years of unchecked selfishness and greed. "Take responsibility?" she spat. "For what? Trying to save a few bucks in this overpriced world?" I shook my head in disgust, realizing that reasoning with her was a lost cause. As we left her house that day, the weight of her isolation seemed to press down on us like a heavy blanket. In the weeks that followed, the harassment only intensified. Neighbors who had once been content to ignore Helen's quirks now went out of their way to make her life miserable. Insults were hurled, property was vandalized, and more than once the police had to be called to calm the situation. Through it all, Helen remained stubbornly defiant, refusing to acknowledge the role her own actions had played in her downfall. But I could see the toll it was taking on her. The way her shoulders slumped a little more each day, the haunted look in her eyes as she ventured out into a world that had turned against her. Ryan and I made it clear that she was welcome to come live with us, to escape the constant barrage of harassment and cruelty. But Helen's pride was too strong, and she steadfastly refused our offers, choosing instead to remain in her self-imposed exile. As the weeks turned into months, and the harassment showed no signs of abating, I could see the light in Helen's eyes slowly dimming. The once vibrant, if misguided woman was fading away, replaced by a shell of her former self, a bitter, broken soul consumed by the consequences of her own actions. And as I watched her spiral deeper and deeper into despair, a part of me felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. This was the karma she had earned, the price she had to pay for years of cruelty and selfishness. It might have been a harsh lesson, but one that was long overdue. As the dust settled and the chaos of Helen's downfall began to fade, I found myself reflecting on how far our family had come. The turmoil we had endured, while painful, had ultimately brought us closer together, a silver lining in the midst of so much darkness. Ryan and I were expecting our second child, a son this time, and the anticipation of new life filled our hearts with hope and joy. We had made the decision for Ryan to leave his corporate job and take up freelancing, allowing him to be more present for our growing family. Lily, our sweet, precocious daughter, had blossomed into a bright and compassionate young girl. Inspired by her grandmother Louise's resilience and her passion for communication, she had taken a keen interest in sign language and was excelling in her studies. "One day, I'm going to be an interpreter," she declared one evening over dinner, her small hands moving fluidly as she signed her words. "That way, everyone can understand each other, no matter what." I couldn't help but smile at her earnest determination, so reminiscent of the woman who had instilled this love of language in her. Louise beamed with pride, her eyes shining with unshed tears as she watched her granddaughter's nimble fingers dance through the air. As for Helen, her fate remained shrouded in uncertainty. We had extended an open invitation for her to come and live with us, to escape the constant harassment and isolation she had endured. But her stubbornness and pride had proven too strong, and she had steadfastly refused our offers, choosing instead to remain in her self-imposed exile. Part of me still felt a twinge of sadness at the thought of her suffering, alone and ostracized from the community she had once been a part of. But a larger part of me knew that this was the price she had to pay for her years of cruelty and selfishness. Karma, it seemed, had finally caught up with her. As the months passed and the birth of our son drew nearer, Ryan and I made the decision to start fresh, a clean slate for our growing family. We packed up our belongings and said goodbye to the town that had been the epicenter of so much drama and heartache. On the day we left, I couldn't resist one final visit to Helen's house. Part of me hoped that she would have a change of heart, that she would see the error of her ways and come with us, seeking redemption and a chance to rebuild the relationships she had so carelessly destroyed. But as I approached her front door, a sense of dread settled in the pit of my stomach. The once well-kept yard was overgrown and unkempt, the windows shuttered and dark. It was clear that Helen had retreated even further into her self-imposed exile, cutting herself off from the world that had turned against her. With a heavy heart, I turned and walked away, leaving Helen to the consequences of her own actions. As I climbed into the car and looked back one last time, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure wash over me. This chapter of our lives was finally coming to an end, and a new, brighter one was just beginning. As we pulled away, the weight of Helen's influence lifted from our shoulders, like a heavy burden we had carried for far too long. In that moment, I made a silent vow to let go of the bitterness and resentment that had consumed us for so long, and to embrace the future with open arms. Our family had been through the fire, tempered and strengthened by the trials we had faced, and as we embarked on this new journey, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, united by the bonds of love and resilience that had carried us through the darkest of times. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The toxic grip of Helen's influence was finally broken, and we were free to forge our own destiny, unshackled by the weight of her cruelty and selfishness. It was a hard-won victory, but one that made the sweetness of our newfound freedom all the more savored. I woke up, my eyes slowly adjusting to the dimly lit room. The curtains were drawn, and only a sliver of sunlight peeked through. As I reached for the lamp on the nightstand, my hand trembled, a reminder of the arduous battle I'd been fighting against the ruthless illness that had ravaged my body. "Good morning, sweetheart," Graham's voice rang out, dripping with saccharine sweetness. "How are you feeling today?" I turned to see him standing in the doorway, a broad smile plastered across his face. By his side was Elliot, his son from a previous marriage, his expression a mirror of Graham's. "I'm feeling a bit better," I rasped, my throat still raw from the treatments. Graham's smile grew wider, and he exchanged a knowing glance with Elliot. "That's wonderful news, dear," he said, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite place. Elliot stepped forward, his eyes locked on mine. "Yeah, we're both so happy to hear that." He chimed in, his voice lacking the sincerity of his words. A sudden chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Graham and Elliot had been nothing but attentive during my illness, but there was an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't ignore. As I struggled to sit up, Graham rushed to my side, his hand resting on my arm in a gesture that was meant to be comforting, but felt oddly possessive. "Once she's gone, all this will be ours." "Elliot," he murmured, his voice low but carrying a weight that hit me like a ton of bricks. My heart dropped, and the room seemed to spin around me. The words echoed in my mind, their implication crystal clear. They were waiting for me to die, their eyes fixed on the prize, my hard-earned wealth and the boutique I had poured my life into. Tears stung my eyes as the crushing realization washed over me. The man I had loved, the man I had trusted with my heart and soul, was nothing more than a deceitful opportunist, and his own son was complicit in his schemes. In that moment, something shifted within me. The naivety that had once clouded my judgment shattered, and a new resolve took root. I would not be a victim, not in my own life, not in my own home. As Graham and Elliot turned to leave, their backs to me, I vowed silently that I would not go down without a fight. They had underestimated me, and I would make them pay for their betrayal. With a steely determination coursing through my veins, I knew that this was just the beginning. The battle lines had been drawn, and I would stop at nothing to reclaim what was rightfully mine. My dignity, my independence, and the life I had worked so hard to build. I couldn't bring myself to confront Graham and Elliot head-on, not yet. Instead, I decided to bide my time, to gather evidence and build my case against them. As I lay in bed, feigning ignorance, my mind drifted back to the early days of my relationship with Graham. It had all started so innocently, a chance encounter at a charity gala. Graham, a wealthy businessman, had been instantly charmed by my wit and confidence. Our conversations flowed effortlessly, and before long we were swept up in a whirlwind romance. "Seraphine," he had whispered, his eyes sparkling with adoration, "you are the most remarkable woman I've ever met." Caught up in the heady rush of new love, I had been blind to the warning signs. Graham's excessive flattery, his constant need for validation, and his tendency to lavish me with extravagant gifts should have raised red flags. But I was too enamored, too eager to believe that I had found the partner I had been searching for all my life. It wasn't until after our wedding that the cracks began to show. Graham's once charming demeanor morphed into something darker, more controlling. He would belittle me in front of his friends, making snide comments about my business acumen or my fashion choices. "A woman like you should be grateful to have a man like me," he would sneer, his words cutting deep. Elliot, who had been a sullen teenager when we first met, quickly fell in line with his father's twisted behavior. The two of them formed an unholy alliance, united in their disdain for me and their insatiable greed. "Why don't you just sell that stupid boutique of yours?" Elliot had once sneered, his lip curled in contempt. "It's not like you're any good at running a business." I should have left then, should have gathered my dignity and walked away from their toxic influence. But I was too proud, too stubborn to admit defeat. As the years passed, Graham's financial troubles mounted, his businesses failing one by one. It was then that his true motivation became clear. He had set his sights on my boutique, the one successful venture I had built from the ground up. "Once you're gone, your precious little shop will be mine," he had hissed, his eyes alight with malice. And now, as I lay in my sickbed, the full extent of their depravity had been revealed. They were willing to let me die, to sacrifice my life for their own selfish gain. But I was no longer the naive woman they thought they could manipulate. The fire of determination burned within me, fueling my resolve to bring them to their knees. As I watched Graham and Elliot leave the room, their shoulders slumped in disappointment at my continued survival, I knew that the time for action was drawing near. They had underestimated me, and they would pay dearly for their mistake. With my newfound determination, I wasted no time in putting my plan into motion. I knew that if I were to take down Graham and Elliot, I needed to be strategic and gather irrefutable evidence of their misdeeds. My first stop was the boutique, the very business they were so eager to get their greedy hands on. As I stepped through the doors, the familiar scent of jasmine and sandalwood enveloped me, offering a sense of comfort and familiarity in the midst of the chaos. "Seraphine!" Leo, my trusted employee, rushed over, his eyes wide with concern. "What are you doing here? Shouldn't you be resting?" I mustered a reassuring smile, determined not to let my personal turmoil show. "I'm feeling much better, Leo. In fact, I've never been more motivated." His brow furrowed, sensing the shift in my demeanor. "Is everything okay?" For a moment I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. But then I remembered the unwavering loyalty Leo had shown me over the years, and I knew he deserved the truth. "Graham and Elliot," I began, my voice low and steady. "They've been plotting against me, waiting for me to die so they can get their hands on the boutique." Leo's jaw dropped, his expression a mix of shock and outrage. "Those bastards!" he exclaimed, his fists clenching at his sides. How could they do such a thing? I placed a calming hand on his arm, grateful for his unwavering support. "That's why I need your help, Leo. We have to gather evidence of their schemes, anything that can expose their true motives." His eyes hardened with resolve, and he nodded firmly. "Whatever you need, I'm here for you." Over the next few days, Leo and I pored over financial records, invoices and receipts, searching for any discrepancies or irregularities that could point to Graham's involvement in my business affairs. It didn't take long to uncover the first bombshell. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been siphoned from the boutique's accounts into offshore holdings under Graham's name. "That lying snake!" Leo spat, slamming his fist on the desk. "He's been stealing from you all this time." I felt a surge of vindication, but also a profound sense of betrayal. The man I had once loved, the man I had trusted with everything, had been robbing me blind all along. But the evidence didn't stop there. We uncovered records of lavish vacations, expensive cars, and designer watches, all purchased with funds stolen from my hard-earned business. As the puzzle pieces fell into place, a newfound determination took root within me. I would no longer be the victim of Graham's greed and deceit. It was time to take back what was rightfully mine. With Leo by my side, I began to meticulously document every shred of evidence, building an airtight case against Graham and his conniving son. They thought they could rob me of my dignity, my independence, and my livelihood, but they had gravely underestimated my resilience. As I stood in the boutique, surrounded by the very business they had tried to strip from me, I felt a sense of empowerment wash over me. This was my legacy, my life's work, and I would fight tooth and nail to protect it. This on, and this held all the cards. Armed with the damning evidence Leo and I had uncovered, I knew it was time to take the next step. I needed to secure my assets and ensure that Graham and Elliot couldn't wriggle their way out of the consequences they so richly deserved. That's when I reached out to Marina, my best friend and a formidable lawyer. We had known each other since college, bonding over our shared ambition and determination to succeed in a male-dominated world. "Marina, I need your help," I said, my voice tense as I recounted the sordid details of Graham's betrayal. To her credit, Marina didn't flinch. She simply nodded, her eyes steely with resolve. "Say no more, Sarah. We're going to make sure those bastards pay for what they've done." Over the next few days, Marina and I worked tirelessly, poring over legal documents and financial records. She was a master strategist, finding every loophole and exploiting every weakness in Graham's carefully constructed web of deceit. "We need to revise your will," she said, her fingers tapping purposefully on the desk. "Make sure that not a single cent of your fortune goes to that snake or his weasel of a son." I nodded, my jaw set with determination. "Absolutely. They don't deserve a penny of what I've built." As we delved deeper into the legal intricacies, Marina's admiration for my strength grew. You know, most women in your position would have crumbled, she remarked, her eyes shining with pride. But not you. You're a fighter, Sarah. Her words buoyed me, reminding me of the steel that coursed through my veins. I was no longer the naive, trusting woman who had fallen for Graham's lies. I was a warrior, a force to be reckoned with. With Marina's guidance, we crafted an airtight strategy. Not only would I be protected from Graham's greed, but we would also set a trap, a carefully laid snare that would ensnare him in his own web of deceit. He won't see it coming, Marina grinned, her eyes glinting with anticipation. And when he does, it'll be too late. As the pieces fell into place, I couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. Graham and Elliot had underestimated me at every turn, and now they would face the full force of my wrath. The day we finalized the legal documents, Marina raised her glass in a toast. To reclaiming what's yours, Sarah. May those snakes get everything they deserve. I clinked my glass against hers, a newfound sense of empowerment coursing through my veins. They won't know what hit them. With Marina by my side, I knew that victory was within reach. Graham and Elliot had made the grave mistake of crossing a woman who was no longer content to play the victim. I was a force to be reckoned with, and they were about to learn that lesson the hard way. As I left Marina's office, my head held high. I couldn't help but smile. The tide had turned, and the predators were about to become the prey. It was time for Graham and Elliot to face the consequences of their actions, and I would savor every moment of their downfall. With the legal groundwork laid and my assets secured, it was time to move to the next phase of my plan, confronting Graham and Elliot head-on. I knew it was a risky move, but the thrill of finally taking control of the situation was too intoxicating to resist. It was a crisp autumn evening when I invited them over for a family dinner, playing the part of the oblivious wife to perfection. As they arrived, Graham's eyes lit up with a mix of greed and surprise. "Seraphine, darling," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Are you sure you're up for hosting dinner? You should be resting." I mustered a weak smile, determined to keep up the charade. "Nonsense, Graham. I'm feeling much better, and I wanted to have a nice family meal." Elliot shot me a skeptical glance. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. "If you say so," he muttered, brushing past me into the dining room. As we sat down to eat, the tension in the air was palpable. Graham and Elliot made small talk, their eyes occasionally darting to the silverware and china, no doubt mentally appraising their potential value. Finally, as the main course was cleared away, I decided it was time to strike. "Graham, Elliot," I began, my voice steady and unwavering. "There's something I need to discuss with you both." Graham's brow furrowed, his mask of concern slipping ever so slightly. "Of course, dear." "What is it?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the confrontation. "I know what you've been up to." The silence that followed was deafening, the air thick with tension. Graham and Elliot exchanged a panicked glance, their faces draining of color. I don't know what you're talking about," Graham stammered, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. I leaned back in my chair, a cold smile playing on my lips. "Oh, I think you do. The embezzlement, the offshore accounts, the fancy cars and vacations, all paid for with money you stole from my business." Elliot's fists clenched, his knuckles turning white. "You have no proof," he spat, his eyes blazing with fury. With a flick of my wrist, I produced a thick stack of documents, the damning evidence Leo and I had gathered. "I think you'll find that I do." Graham's face contorted into a mask of rage, his true colors finally revealed. "You conniving bitch," he snarled, slamming his fist on the table. "You think you can take everything from me?" I met his gaze unflinchingly, my resolve unwavering. "I'm not taking anything from you, Graham. I'm simply reclaiming what's rightfully mine." Elliot leaped to his feet, his chair clattering to the floor. "This isn't over," he growled, his eyes burning with hatred. "We'll make you pay for this." I couldn't help but laugh, a rich, mocking sound that only seemed to infuriate them further. "Oh, my dear boy, it's already over. You just don't know it yet." As they stormed out of the house, hurling insults and threats over their shoulders, I felt a sense of exhilaration coursing through my veins. The game was afoot, and for the first time I held all the cards. Graham and Elliot had underestimated me, thinking I was nothing more than a meek, submissive woman, but they were about to learn a brutal lesson. I was a force to be reckoned with, and I would stop at nothing to reclaim what was mine. The days following my explosive confrontation with Graham and Elliot were a whirlwind of activity. With Marina's guidance, we wasted no time in setting our legal strategy into motion. First, we filed for divorce, citing Graham's embezzlement and financial misdeeds as grounds for the dissolution of our marriage. The paperwork was airtight, backed by the mountain of evidence Leo and I had gathered. "He won't know what hit him," Marina grinned as she slid the documents across her desk for my signature. "By the time this is over, he'll be lucky to have the clothes on his back." Next, we turned our attention to the criminal charges. Graham's theft from my business, coupled with his blatant fraud and money laundering, was more than enough to ensure he faced serious consequences. As we sat in Marina's office, poring over the legal documents, a loud knock at the door interrupted our work. Marina's assistant poked her head in, her face pale. "Miss Cole, the police are here. They say they need to speak with you and Miss Westbrook immediately." Marina and I exchanged a knowing glance, silently bracing ourselves for the confrontation to come. Sure enough, two stern-faced detectives strode into the office, their eyes fixed on Graham's financials spread across Marina's desk. "Miss Westbrook?" "Mr. Westbrook," the taller detective began, his voice gruff. "We have reason to believe that you've been involved in a massive embezzlement scheme, siphoning funds from your wife's business into offshore accounts." Graham, who had been summoned to Marina's office under the guise of signing divorce papers, blanched visibly. "This is preposterous," he sputtered, his eyes darting wildly between Marina and me. "I would never do such a thing." The detective arched an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by Graham's bravado. "Is that so? Then perhaps you can explain these financial records?" He slid a stack of documents across the desk, the very evidence Leo and I had painstakingly gathered. Graham's eyes widened as he frantically flipped through the pages, his facade crumbling with each damning entry. This is a mistake," he stammered, his voice quavering. "These records must have been doctored." Marina let out a derisive snort, her eyes narrowed in contempt. "Save it, Graham. The jig is up, and you know it." As the detective slapped handcuffs on Graham's wrists, reading him his rights, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication wash over me. The man who had once held so much power over me, the man who had sought to strip me of everything I held dear, was now being led away in disgrace. But the true triumph came when Elliot burst into the office, his face flushed with fury. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his eyes wild. "Where's my father?" Marina gestured towards the door, a wicked smile playing on her lips. "Your father is being taken into custody, Elliot. It seems his little embezzlement scheme has finally caught up with him." Elliot's jaw dropped, his eyes darting between Graham and the detectives. No, this can't be happening." I couldn't resist twisting the knife, relishing in his anguish. "Oh, but it is, Elliot. Your father's greed has finally come back to bite him, and you're next." As the detectives hauled Graham away, his muffled protests fading into the distance, I turned to face Elliot. The fear in his eyes was palpable, and I reveled in the knowledge that his world was crumbling around him. "You thought you could take everything from me," I said, my voice laced with barely contained triumph. "But in the end, you'll be lucky if you're left with the shirts on your backs." Elliot opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his lips. He knew the game was up, and there was nothing he could do to stop the wheels of justice from turning. As he slunk out of Marina's office, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I couldn't help but savor the moment. Graham and Elliot had underestimated me at every turn, and now they were paying the ultimate price for their hubris. The battle was won, and I had emerged victorious, a force to be reckoned with, a woman who had reclaimed her power and her dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. The days leading up to Graham's trial were a whirlwind of activity. The media had caught wind of the scandal, and the story of the embezzling husband and his deceitful stepson dominated the headlines. As Marina and I arrived at the courthouse, a throng of reporters swarmed us, cameras flashing and microphones thrust in our faces. "Miss Westbrook, how do you feel knowing your husband betrayed you in such a despicable way? Do you think Graham and Elliot will receive the maximum sentence?" I pushed through the crowd, my jaw set with determination. Marina fought her way to my side, her steely gaze daring the reporters to cross her. "No comment," she barked, her voice cutting through the cacophony of questions. "We'll have our say in the courtroom." As the courtroom doors swung open, I caught my first glimpse of Graham and Elliot since their arrests. They sat at the defense table, their once arrogant demeanors replaced by a sullen, defeated air. Graham's eyes met mine, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a glimmer of the man I had once loved, the charming, charismatic figure who had swept me off my feet. But that illusion was quickly shattered by the cold reality of his betrayal, and I felt nothing but contempt for the man before me. The trial was a brutal affair, with Marina systematically dismantling Graham's flimsy defense. Each witness, each piece of damning evidence, served to further unravel the web of lies he had so carefully constructed. "Mr. Westbrook, you stand accused of embezzling over $2 million from your wife's business," the prosecutor stated, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "How do you plead?" Graham's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room in a desperate bid for escape. "Not guilty," he croaked, the words ringing hollow even to his own ears. As the trial wore on, the weight of the evidence against Graham and Elliot became insurmountable. Bank records, financial statements, even damning testimony from former employees, all of it pointed to their guilt. Elliot, his once youthful arrogance replaced by a pale, haunted expression, took the stand in a last-ditch effort to salvage their crumbling defense. "My father and I were just trying to protect our family's interests," he pleaded, his voice trembling. "We never meant to cause any harm." Marina seized the opportunity, her eyes glinting with triumph. "Is that so, Mr. Westbrook? Then why did you and your father make numerous attempts to conceal the embezzled funds in offshore accounts?" Elliot's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. He was caught, trapped in the inescapable web of his own lies. As the jury filed back into the courtroom, a hush fell over the gallery. The foreman stood, his expression grave, and delivered the verdict we had all been waiting for. On the charges of embezzlement, fraud, and money laundering, we find the defendants, Graham Westbrook and Elliot Westbrook, guilty on all counts. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, but I remained steadfast, my gaze fixed on Graham and Elliot. Their faces were a study in anguish, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. As the judge handed down their sentences, lengthy prison terms and hefty fines, I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. These men, who had once held such power over me, were reduced to nothing more than common criminals, their greed and deceit laid bare for all to see. As the bailiffs led them away, Graham turned to me one last time, his eyes pleading for forgiveness. But I had none to give. He had made his choices, and now he would have to live with the consequences. In the aftermath of the trial, I found myself standing in the bustling boutique that had been at the center of this sordid saga. Leo approached me, his eyes shining with admiration. "You did it, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You beat them at their own game." I surveyed the shop, taking in the familiar sights and scents that had once brought me such joy. Now they represented something more, a symbol of my resilience, my refusal to be a victim. "No, Leo," I replied, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "We did it. Together, we reclaimed what was rightfully ours." As I looked toward the future, I knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But with the strength and determination I had discovered within myself, I was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, stronger, wiser, and forever unbroken. The months following Graham and Elliot's sentencing were a whirlwind of activity. With the legal battles finally behind me, I was able to turn my attention to rebuilding my life and my business. The first order of business was revitalizing the boutique. I poured every ounce of my energy into breathing new life into the place that had once been the source of so much turmoil. Leo was by my side every step of the way, his unwavering support and loyalty a constant source of strength. Together, we overhauled the decor, updated the merchandise, and implemented new marketing strategies to attract a fresh wave of customers. "This place is going to be better than ever? Sarah?" Leo beamed as we surveyed our handiwork. "Just you wait and see." And he was right. Within a matter of months, the boutique was thriving once again, a testament to the resilience and determination that had carried me through my darkest days. But my journey didn't end there. As I stood amidst the racks of designer clothing and the sparkling displays, I couldn't help but reflect on the countless women who had found themselves in situations similar to mine, trapped in abusive relationships, stripped of their dignity and independence by the very people who were supposed to love and protect them. It was then that the idea took root, a foundation dedicated to empowering and supporting women who had endured the kind of betrayal and deceit that I had faced, a safe haven where they could rebuild their lives, reclaim their strength, and emerge as the warriors they were always meant to be. With a newfound sense of purpose, I immersed myself in the planning and execution of this ambitious endeavor. I poured my heart and soul into creating a comprehensive support system, complete with legal resources, counseling services, and vocational training programs. The day the Foundation's doors opened, I stood before a crowd of supporters, my heart swelling with pride and determination. Too many women have had their voices silenced, their spirits crushed by those who sought to control and exploit them, I declared, my voice ringing out with conviction. But no more. This foundation is a sanctuary, a place where you can find the strength to reclaim your power and forge a new path, one defined by resilience, courage, and an unwavering belief in yourselves. The cheers and applause that followed were deafening, a resounding affirmation that my mission had struck a chord. Women from all walks of life, united in their shared experiences, embraced me with tears of gratitude and hope shining in their eyes. In the months and years that followed, the Foundation flourished, becoming a beacon of hope and empowerment for countless women who had endured the unimaginable. I poured my heart and soul into mentoring and guiding them, sharing the lessons I had learned through my own ordeal. And as I stood before each graduating class, watching these remarkable women stride across the stage with their heads held high, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of pride and fulfillment. They were the living embodiments of resilience, proof that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit could prevail. As for me, I had embarked on a journey I never could have imagined, one that had taken me from the depths of despair to the heights of personal triumph. The woman I had become was a far cry from the naive, trusting soul who had fallen prey to Graham's machinations. I was a warrior, a survivor, and a beacon of hope for all those who had been wronged. And as I looked toward the future, I knew that my work was far from over. There were countless battles yet to be fought, countless lives to be reclaimed from the shadows of oppression and deceit. But I was ready. Armed with the strength and wisdom born of my experiences, I would continue to forge ahead, lighting the way for others to follow. For in the end, that was the true essence of victory, not just reclaiming what was rightfully mine, but empowering others to do the same.